The deserts are the laboratories of the future for how most of us will have to survive on this planet as it becomes hotter and drier. Climate change is more than drought. It's heat waves and it's salinity and it's crumbling infrastructure and it's uncertainty. And so that's why having a diverse set of beverages that we rely upon based on a diverse set of plants and yeast is really important.
Welcome to the Organic Wine Podcast. Hello, this is Adam Huss coming to you from Los Angeles. Thanks for listening. Gary Paul Nabhan is an agriculture ecologist, ethnobotanist, ecumenical Franciscan brother, and author of over 30 books. His work is focused primarily on the interaction of biodiversity and cultural diversity in the arid binational Southwest. He is considered a pioneer in the local food movement and the heirloom seed-saving movement. A first-generation Lebanese American, Nabhan was raised in Gary, Indiana, and he worked at the headquarters for the first Earth Day in Washington, D.C. Gary has achieved numerous degrees, including a Ph.D. in the interdisciplinary arid lands resource sciences, and he has received numerous awards and medals, including a Macarthur Fellowship. He co-founded Native Seeds, a nonprofit organization which works to preserve place-based Southwestern agricultural plants, and he did the research to help create Ironwood Forest National Monument. He now serves as the Kellogg Endowed Chair in Southwestern Borderlands Food and Water Security at the University of Arizona, where he founded the Center for Regional Food Studies and catalyzed the initiative to have UNESCO designate Tucson as the first city of gastronomy in the U.S. Despite all this, I only came to hear about Gary when Ricky Taylor of Alta Marfa forwarded me an article about Gary's intra-institutional work to catalog and preserve the rich diversity of Mexico's traditional fermented beverages. Maybe this shows my need to broaden my scope, or maybe it shows the power of these fermented beverages to capture attention. I'll let you decide. Regardless, I'm so grateful to have discovered the wealth and wisdom of this guy, Gary Paul Nabhan, and I'm thrilled to be able to share him with you. I can't think of a better episode for Thanksgiving holiday than this conversation with Gary. Thank you for caring about the things we discuss on this podcast, and happy Thanksgiving. Enjoy. Gary, welcome. Thank you so much for joining. It's really an honor to be able to have this conversation with you.
Well, it's a joy for me too. So thank you and thank your listeners.
And, you know, like I said, I'm kind of sad to say that I just found about you and your body of work recently, but I've really connected personally with so much of what you've had to say that I've discovered already. And the way that my sort of entree to you and your work was this article titled "Biodiversity in a Bottle: Uncovering Mexico's Traditional Fermented Beverages." And of course, I'm very into fermented beverages. And this is about how you and a multi-institutional team of academics and scientists, it sound like, are researching and actually mapping the diversity of and cultural history of traditional Mexican fermented beverages.
That's a good summary. And I want to say that term biodiversity in a bottle really applies to fermented beverages, both in the United States and Mexico, more than any food and beverage I can think of, that the large variety of bacterial strains and yeasts that winemakers and fermentation artisans in Mexico are using have really sort of opened up the bottle that the genie had closed for a number of centuries.
Oh, I love that. Well, that's a good tease. And I'll give my own personal context to you, which is, I've lived in Los Angeles for 25 years now and have, seen repeatedly worsening droughts happening in California over that time. And over that same time, I've kind of gotten to know and fall in love with wine and learned how grapes are grown. And it just sort of dawned on me that maybe we should consider making wine from fruit that requires less water. So that's where I sort of came. We're making wine from some prickly pear that we're foraging here in Los Angeles, and then I came across your study and was super excited to see. I had already known that I was participating in a centuries old, millennial old traditions that dated far before I had this bright idea. And I just would love to give more context to that for everyone involved in wine for the same reason. But maybe before we jump into that, can we get a little context about you and your life? You are a desert denizen, but you've had a pretty amazing life of travels and research and studies and things that I will introduce. But if you could sort of, maybe give us a little context to this, and also just a little context to what led you to this study. So maybe, I guess what I'm asking for is your entire life story and the unabridged history of indigenous agriculture in North America.
Well, let me try to
Go.
capsulize that because I don't want to hear any snoring coming back when this is played. I'm an Arab American, and my grandfather and his brothers and cousins um, on the Lebanon Syria border in the Bekaa Valley were among the people, not just a few, but many people in Arab countries that have made both great wines and a distillate called arak, that's an anisette, much like the ouzo that probably more of your listeners have tasted.
Right.
And
Right.
so
Uzo and
I've looked
grappa.
at
Yeah.
arid land winemaking, not only in Lebanon and Syria and Morocco, Canary Islands, but in parts of Mexico and the U.S. as well. I live right by the U.S. Mexican border in Santa Cruz County, which has more wineries at mid elevations, 4,000 to 5,500 feet, than any other part of Arizona. And talking with the winemakers who are my neighbors, they're constantly grappling to get varieties that can tolerate the heat, maybe mature later in the
Mm,
summer and fall, so that all the wonderful sugars don't get concentrated without bringing the flavor along. And so
right.
I've thought about um, winemaking and other fermented beverages for 35 years since I first lived in this county decades ago. And then more recently, I've become engaged with the future of mezcal and tequila and the many fermented beverages that are made from those same iconic plants, the agaves or century plants. And I, I basically live a bilingual, binational, bicultural kind of life down here on the border. So I've been very attentive to the traditional fermented beverages in the northern Mexican deserts and have joined this team of Mexican scientists that are looking at the value of those probiotic beverages nationwide.
I love that. Y- you are described as an ethnobotanist, and I'm just curious if you can sort of give a sense of what that means. It's such a fascinating term to me.
Well, the funniest way to say it, I guess, is that we keep our ears open to all the traditions of food and farming and medicine and beverage making that have emerged over thousands of years rather than dismissing them and starting all over again from scratch. That there's incredible knowledge, traditional culinary and ecological knowledge embedded in indigenous people's work with plants and the way they continue to use them today. And much of that knowledge is endangered because of the kind of marketing of soft drinks and a few select fermented beverages at the expense of all the others that have emerged culturally over thousands of years. So, in my case, a lot of what I do is about ethnobotany for the future. We know that we're coming into a warmer, drier era. And how can we learn from the desert peoples who've been dealing with those conditions for centuries, if not millennia, and already have solutions to some of the problems that the rest of us are now trying to deal with?
Yeah, I love that. Can you? I mean, I'm struck by your sense of the diversity of these beverages. When I, just look at what we think of in America as the fermented beverage landscape. It's like beer, wine, and spirits. And there's maybe 3 or 4 different kinds of spirits, maybe 5. What kind of diversity have you found? Can you talk a little bit about that? Some of the data or just some of the findings. What kind of plants have been used? What kind of beverages have been made?
Sure. There's about 16 distinctive types of fermented and probiotic beverages in Mexico and the US Southwest. Keep in mind that there wasn't a border here till 150
Right,
years ago, and that those traditions occurred right where I'm living, south of Tucson. But
right.
they include over 145 species of plants, not just corn and wheat and barley that are used, of course, for a lot of distilled beverages and grapes uh, and other fruits that are used for wines. But they infuse many other fruits and nuts and herbs in those fermented beverages. And what's astonishing is that some of these fermented beverages have dozens of yeast and uh, 50 to 100 kinds of fermentation bacteria in them, where many uh, young winemakers may just get a single strain of brewer's yeast or champagne yeast to start off their fermentation. These people are using pottery vessels or wooden barrels that literally are drawing upon 6 to 8 different genera of yeast, not just a single species like Saccharomyces
Oh,
cerevisiae. So,
right.
both in terms of the plant uh, base or raw materials and the number of yeasts that are being uh, in an interactive way in the fermentation process, um, mezcal and tepache and tezuino and these other beverages far outdistance any other beverages in the world for the variety of fermentation microbes in them. And so they're actually more like kimchi than they are like the beverages that Europeans are used to. They have so many complex flavors and fragrances.
Why? I mean, have you got to taste a lot of these?
I have, and I've also made many at my home. Sandor Katz, art of fermentation author, did a workshop at my home for about 70 people, sort of outdoors, hands on workshop on food and beverage fermentation. And we took pots, large clay oyas or pottery vessels from border tribes and used their roots that they use as catalysts for fermentation, or I should say, really regulators of fermentation, and tried them out with different substrates of fruits or native corns or Spanish introduced wheats or grapes. And um, there's really a renaissance of interest in all of this. I've talked at the fermentation festival in Wisconsin and other events like that in Arizona. And so I'm just one of hundreds of people in the Southwest states and thousands in Mexico that regularly make some of these things.
Oh, that's great. So these are living beverages that have lots of probiotic microbial living activity happening, theoretically good for you, healthful for you potentially. Um,
Yes, they're too good just to study. I mean, I'm one of those guys that doesn't study anything unless I do it. The point is
right.
that they're delicious, but what we know about probiotic beverages, including this iconic one that is made both with corn and agaves or mezcal, that's called tezuino. Um, it's it's much more healthful than the raw materials they're made from. You're releasing not only flavors and fragrances through all the volatiles in them, but also amino acids that you can't find in the crop itself, but you can find in the fermentation vat.
Oh, wow. Yeah, um let's talk a sort of a bigger picture question. Why did these people create these fermented beverages? I mean, do you have a sense that Did each have its separate
That
use? Was there
is
ritual
the
use,
million
medicinal
dollar
use,
question.
recreational?
No, I mean, keep in mind that people use clay pots for storage of grains and fruits over centuries and millennia, and sometimes the naturally occurring yeast and bacteria would just get into those pots. And then they'd use
Right.
that same pot over and over if it had a really nice flavor to the beverages that came out of it. But they were used ceremonially too. We now think that there was prehistoric distillation of agaves or century plants in Mexico, that it was not introduced from the New World to the New World by the Spanish, that centuries before the Spanish and perhaps Asians arrived in uh, North America, there was a fermentation tradition, but it was micro distillation, just a cup of distilled alcohol per uh, head of agave, and that was probably used ceremonially. The
Hmm.
cactus beverages that I've drunk here in the Sonoran Desert of Arizona and adjacent Mexico are all used for rain bringing ceremonies during the summer. When we have a drought, they have these ceremonies to call down the clouds and the rains. And so it's almost like a sacrament, like wine is in the Christian traditions. And so it has a special cultural role. These are not just commodities to the people who drink them.
Right. There may be some sacramental or is that the right term? Sacramental use? Would you
It
say for that kind of?
it is true. We think of the Eucharist, the Christian tradition of uh, uh, bread and wine as a body and blood, as the only sacramental use of a beverage, but it's clear that there's analogs in indigenous spirituality.
And do you have you had a favorite that you've experienced?
Well, I'm going to mention three things just quickly,
Okay.
and we can talk in more detail about that. Uh, there's historic records going back to the 16th century that people fermented mesquite pods. Now, mesquite is a legume tree that has pods much like carob or St. John's bread from the old world. It's basically a big pod that it's not the seed, but the pod itself that is cracked or ground and then fermented. And they bury that pod in the ground in Mexico. And this is described in the early documents. And it's sort of a musty mix. It almost looks like a gravy when they uh, put the pods in water and then stir them. There's a lot of flour like must in it. But within 2 months of being in a sealed pod in the ground, it turns into a clear wine that's just extraordinary. And
Mm.
people have also drunk agaves like that, not just as tequila or distilled mezcal, but they used to call all these products vino de mezcal or vino de mezquite. So there
Mm.
was probably widespread use of agaves and cactus fruits for fermented beverages well before anyone decided to distill them into the beverages that most people now associate with Mexico.
And are those? I mean, is the mesquite one of your favorites?
It is. It's just absolutely delicious. It tastes almost like a Chardonnay, but it has this hint of the smoky mesquite flavor that
Mm.
some of us associate with barbecue or wood fired
Right.
steak. So it has this incredible smoky aftertaste and is really delicious. I have to say that there's also some great uh, historic grape wines from Baja California and Sonora that are called Vino Generoso. And that is a wine that's homemade. It was also used for communion purposes. The Spanish probably introduced this tradition, but it was used with the mission grape, the first grape that came into California, Arizona, and New Mexico. And it's still made today in Baja California. One of the interesting things about that grape is that even though it's a dark blue purple grape, when you ferment it, all the color fades from it, and it feels more like it looks and to some extent tastes more like a white wine rather than a tannin rich red wine.
Yeah, yeah, we've got a lot of that going on here in Southern California too. I actually have a cutting from an old pre-prohibition vineyard growing in my backyard right now of a mission one of the old mission vines that had been neglected for 100 years. Um,
That's what
Very
I go
interesting.
to. Yeah.
Oh, fantastic! Now, so you live on a small acreage there, if I understand correctly. Is that right?
That's right. We have 4.5 acres of land and another acre of a pond. And around that, I grow about 140 different heirloom fruits and nut tree varieties from the deserts of all the world's continents. I've been collecting heirloom uh, fruits for over 30 years. And so I grow 35 kinds of pomegranates and 6 kinds of quinces and 5 kinds of figs, et cetera, et cetera. And the ones I don't ferment, I make into shrubs, the vinegar-based syrups, um, and I also have a roasting pit for roasting the agaves and sotols that are traditionally pit roasted in this area. Um, for fermented beverages, not for distilled beverages. So if
Right.
alcohol guns and firearms are listening out there, my roasting pit is not for being a bootlegger. It's just for having fermented beverages.
Right, right. Um, that sounds like a full-time job with 4 acres of that many species. Is that you have time to write and study?
Well, I would say that this summer when we had 25 inches instead of 5 inches of rain like we had the year before, I was up to my elbows. That's a polite word, elbows in weeds, and I'm just now recovering from that. But I don't have many trees of each of those varieties, but I have about
Right.
easily an acre and a half to almost 2 acres of fruit trees scattered around our 4 acres.
You said there's something about a difference in rainfall. Could you repeat that?
Yes, this is the one thing that all the winemakers have to contend with down here. That last year we had 5 inches of rainfall, less than one third of the average, and this year we had 25, 5 times as much as we had last year. So that's why most of the winemakers in our county have 15 to 20 different varieties, and they only sell blends really because you
Right.
never know which varieties are going to do well and which aren't. I should mention
Yeah.
that even with the mezcal makers in the deserts, oftentimes they're using 5 to 10 different species of agaves or century plants, not varieties, but entire species, equivalent to grapes or wheat or barley, in a single fermentation vat, or they're separately fermenting them and then blend them after distillation. So blending uh, grape varieties or agave varieties is really another strategy. There's very few single varietals.
It sounds like diversity is the strategy there.
That's right. Not putting all your eggs in one basket is the name of the game in deserts because of the climate uncertainty.
And it does sound like this research that you're doing, as fun as it may be, and and obviously interesting, ties really well into your history. I mean, you've been called the father of the local food movement, and it seems like I have that perspective of as well as living in a place where so much of the food that we have available is trucked in from many places around the world, and more that seems unsustainable. And looking for these, finding these indigenous and traditional beverages or any kinds of foods really just seems like the future of the survival of these urban centers in the Southwest. Can you
That's
talk a little bit how that? Yeah, please
Oh,
go ahead.
you're right on target. I mean, I have been involved in the local food movement really since its beginning in the U.S. When someone, I was sort of horrified when I first heard someone call me the father of the local food movement because my wife said, "There's something you haven't been telling me. Who's the mother?" Um, but as I get older, I'm more involved in local beverages and local foods. And I think the wonderful thing is we have mixologists all over Tucson and Phoenix, just like in Mexico, that are using these fermented beverages and shrubs in terrific cocktails. So there's Tezuino cocktails made with fermented corn, tepache, which is usually fermented pineapple with cinnamon and other spices in it. And those are all being
Mm.
integrated into some great cocktails in California, Arizona, and nearly every state in Mexico. Let me just say another thing about uh, what I call planet desert, that the deserts are the laboratories of the future for how most of us will have to survive on this planet as it becomes hotter and drier. And so from LA Basin over to El Paso, we're facing yield declines, increasing production costs for beverage and food plants. And that's why we really need to pay attention to these desert adapted varieties and species because some of them use only a fifth of the water that is used for most conventional crops like corn.
Yeah, I've just again, your work is really amazing for anyone who wants to get a glimpse of where we're headed. I think your work over the last 40 years is now has never been more relevant. And I'm just wondering how you feel. I mean, you were in a way sounding the alarm about the climate emergency and our unsustainable agricultural system back in the 70s. And a lot of time has passed, and I'm just wondering what it's like to both see some of that, some of the chickens come home to roost, so to speak, but also to have not been listened to, I think, in large part over that time while this is getting worse and worse.
Well, the funny thing is that most of us who love to innovate have never been slowed down or impaired by people don't who don't get what we're doing. There'd be no innovation in the world if we just listened to the first person who said, "That sounds really crazy. Are you sure that's going to work?" And so the point is, I started talking about these issues in the late 1970s and early 80s, and I was way beyond the fringe of the agricultural community here. And as I get older, I guess because I've stuck around and not died of poisoning of any of these crazy plants that I've tried, it's not like I get respect, but people draw me into dialogues about these things, including many farmers who are looking for solutions. So I'm excited that just yesterday I was in a restaurant for lunch in Tucson, Arizona, and the drink that I had for lunch had both prickly pear cactus and mesquite in it. And I thought, I've lived long enough now where the things that I only dreamed of being in the marketplace are already in the marketplace. There's over 150 uh, native desert foods and beverages produced by over 40 micro enterprises in the Tucson, Arizona area. And we're the first city of gastronomy in the United States to be designated by the United Nations for two reasons. One, we're innovating about how to live in a hotter, drier world. And two, we're the place with the oldest agriculture in the continental United States. 5,000 years of corn production just a half mile away from where I have my office in Tucson. So there's a lot of hope that I have now because what we thought was pie in the sky, or we were told by critics was pie in the sky in the 1970s and 80s, uh, people have had to reconsider and implement because, as we know, necessity is the mother of invention.
Right. It does seem extremely necessary. Did that 25 inches do anything to the level of the Colorado River this
No,
year?
it didn't. And that's a really interesting thing because farmers get drought relief payments. And this last year wasn't a drought year. they don't get climate change relief. they they
Right.
need to begin to use their drought payments to establish long-term measures that will help them deal with climate change. But climate change is more than drought. It's heat waves and it's salinity and it's crumbling infrastructure and it's uncertainty. And so that's why having a diverse set of beverages that we rely upon based on a diverse set of plants and yeast is really important. And one yeast might do really well in high temperatures and another one in lower temperatures. So we also have to be selecting the ones that can survive hot and dry.
Well, I've heard you say, speaking of diversity, it seems like a really great theme that I'd love to talk to you about more. I've heard you say that we are all impoverished when we out of relationship with each other. And I feel like there's a growing lack of diversity in the kinds of relationships that we have in this country, that we're very often siloed in terms of mindset, in terms of culture, and in so many other ways. And I'm wondering, could you talk about that and how that's true, how how important it is to maintain these diverse relationships, both from biological relationships in the soil with humans and plants, as well as between each other and the rest of nature.
That's such a great question that's fundamental to my whole way of looking at the world. Let me try to unpack it first in the cultural part of that question. I've been blessed by being of Arab origin and seeing the world through Arab eyes, not just Anglo eyes. But I've also worked on 20 uh, indigenous or Native American uh, reservations in the US and Mexico where they don't think the way we do about plants, about the economy, or about farming. And I've learned so much from those people who allowed me to be their understudies in how to farm and produce fruit and draw upon all the many uh, herbs that you can use to infuse beverages with. I wouldn't have had that if I just had a straight scientific uh, discipline as my only source of information. And so the studies of creativity that are being done worldwide say that people who are multilingual are often more creative in their problem solving skills because they can do what's called cognitive switching. When, instead of running into a roadblock because you only have one language or one way of looking at the world to guide you, they can get around that roadblock by switching to another language and another cultural sensibility, and other doors open up. And so this
Mm.
is really fundamental to how I think about the dilemma of climate change. We need solutions, but all those solutions are not going to come from academia or from top down government programs. They're going to bubble up like a blessed ferment from the bottom, the grassroots, and infect and delight people of many cultures by this blessed ferment that comes when we interact with one another. So, cultural diversity is as important to surviving and thriving under new climate regimes as the natural diversity of grapes and fruits and grains that we've been talking about during this program.
How how can food and wine, which I think of as food, help in this process? How does it
Well,
build bridges, or how could it build bridges?
first of all, uh,
Or
the basic idea of having diverse people coming together to share food and drink at a table is a way we most frequently understand other cultures when we have feasts together and change food and beverage traditions up to accommodate other people. The second part of that is that uh, these fermented foods and beverages from these traditions, they not only taste great, but they're really high in antioxidants and probiotics that help us overcome oxidative stress, which is one of the major sets of maladies and diseases that are hitting us in the Western United States today. That farm workers and outdoor workers are now the most frequent people in emergency rooms other than COVID victims because of trying to work out in 120-degree weather. And that
Mm.
depletes all the antioxidants that are already in their body. And so it's like dehydration. It's metaphorically equivalent to that, that if you deplete all your antioxidants, your metabolism has no way to be buffered from the heat and the dryness. And so these fermented beverages, including all the resveratrols in wines, the antioxidants that are so rich in grape skins, are literally a way that will help us adapt to climate change. It's not just that we can get a little bit tipsy and say, well, I survived the day, but the antioxidants in our wines are really helping us adapt to climate change.
Oh, wow. I mean, because I needed an excuse to drink more. Thank you. Um,
We all do.
uh, oh, thanks. Well, you wear so many hats. I would say. I mean, that's not even the right way to put it. There's so many ways that somebody could refer to you and your expertise. Is there a way that you are finding yourself drawn to now in your life that is a main mode, or is it the diversity of things that you are that is is the fun part?
Well, I think I shed labels like rattlesnakes shed skins. I just have never stayed in one mental or spiritual place long enough for a label to fit me very well. It's like a, a bad pair of pants after a while. I need another pair of pants so that I can walk more comfortably. And so I really don't care what I'm called. I think a lot of my work is on that cusp, that intersection, that inflection point between cultural diversity, biodiversity, and food diversity. And that's why I love the wonderful experimentation with diversity that's going on in the fermented food and beverage movements. And uh, winemakers are part of those. People who are infusing their gins with local herbs that just kick the whole flavor profile of a gin up another notch compared to English gins. These innovations really matter in the long run, and they're fun. It's not just an academic or conceptual thing. It These things really taste better and allow us to reflect on how diversity is important in every realm of our life.
Yeah, I love that. I also I'm really fascinated by your work with mesquite, or you wrote a book on mesquite, in which you talk about arboreality. Can you talk about that concept? Um,
Yeah, first of all, I think our agriculture is going to change more towards perennial plants that are deep rooted and leave carbon in the soil. And we'll see annual crops disappearing in many
yeah,
landscapes in Arizona, California, and elsewhere. And so mesquite is sort of like the tree of life of the desert. People get most of their firewood, building materials, medicines, and foods from mesquite in the most extreme deserts and have done so for 8,000 years. So, why would we turn our back on a tree like that that's literally the desert tree of life? And I've just had so much fun working with mesquite. We have a mesquite hammer mill in our garage, and we bring it out 3 or 4 times a year and have community based mesquite pod millings. And we help get that mesquite flour. It's almost like a pastry flour. It's so delicious. You can compare it to uh, chestnut flour or carob flour or powder. It's excellent for pastries, also good for beers, and is in cappuccinos dusted on top of uh, a cup of cappuccino in Tucson. So it's also kind of the iconic plant of the Tucson area, along with the giant saguaro cactus. And so
mm,
all of these things reinforce our sense of place when we pay attention to the things right at our doorstep that can have value to our food and beverage system.
Yeah, I mean, bringing value to your local culture through these local foods and beverages. I mean, local ingredients. And I love, I love mesquite as that example. I guess I'm thinking about what you might suggest for somebody living anywhere, especially in an urban center, since that's where I'm speaking to you from. Um, what could we do to reconnect, or I mean, what are some of the proactive things that we could do to have a more resilient and diverse food and beverage system that we could actually take action from our urban centers?
Well, I love that question. And I should say right off the bat, I'm not some kind of local food Nazi like a couple of the comic characters in Portlandia a few years ago who wouldn't touch anything that isn't from more than 3 miles away. So I'm
Right.
not dogmatic about this. I think in the LA basin, you have such an extraordinary diversity of cultures with knowledge about fermented beverages that you can really draw on there, that you're primed to absorb the cultural uh, traditions in a place like LA probably better than any other place in the US because there's so many grocery stores of different ethnicities that feature these things. So I see valuing that as much in an urban setting as people in my rural setting can value all the different native food plants here. I just think it varies where we are. There's so many
Right.
things in the California foothills and along the ocean front that you can draw on that makes LA cuisine and Ensenada taco cuisine unique. And each place that we are, we don't need to copycat another place. We can just draw upon the great diversity of things that we have culturally and naturally at our own doorstep.
Yeah, I love that. And this is a sort of a random question, but it's almost Thanksgiving. How do you feel about Thanksgiving? Do you have any traditions or thoughts that you have about Thanksgiving?
It's actually the holiday that I've loved the most since I was a child.
Yeah, me
And
too.
it's always because my Lebanese American family did sort of Thanksgiving fusion dinners where we'd have um, a turkey and a roasted lamb that had been butchered that morning with raw lamb meat and then kibbeh and other lamb dishes alongside the turkey. And I
Wow.
love that we let our cultural diversity back into Thanksgiving. I've helped Indian communities here do teachings all fall long of harvesting wild plants and grinding or preparing cultivated crops that are part of their tradition. And then on Thanksgiving Day, the grade school students make a meal with all the foods that their community used before the pilgrims arrived in North America. And so we can sort of flip Thanksgiving on its head that it's not about colonization and imperialism, but about what we have in our own communities that we can celebrate through food and beverage and communal celebrations.
Yeah, I agree. I try to reclaim it rather like you said, uh, as a beautiful thing rather than a reminder of colonialism and exploitation. Um, Bringing back some of those, or not bringing back, but redefining it, I guess, like you said.
Redefining it, that's right. It's I like that term, flipping it on its head, because
Yeah,
none of us really tolerate that colonial mentality anymore. But it's hard to um, rid an entire holiday from it, but to give ourselves some juxtapositions where we remember and learn from that history rather than blindly accepting it as a foregone conclusion, I think is the game that's fun to play.
well, it sounds like a lot of your work has been making connections and overcoming prejudices between people as much as it is in foods and culture. Culturally through foods. Do you have any hope for America that, in that sense, in terms of our ability to overcome current divides, and if so, where do you see that?
Well, I wrote a book on that topic called Food from the Radical Center about
Yeah.
4 years ago that presaged how deep the divide is in our country now, which is just heartbreaking to me as it is to most of us, that neighbors don't even talk to neighbors anymore just because of their political ideologies. And and so the Food from the Radical Center book is really about efforts between Democrats, Republicans, faith-based and science-based people of different ethnicities to bring back things like the mission olive and mission grape in Southern California that have been there for 400 years, or the heirloom turkeys in the Midwest. About 10 years ago, when I was on the Slow Food Arc of Taste, we seeded great American picnics all over the United States at Thanksgiving time, where we celebrated the heritage foods and beverages of our own locality. And what we
Mm.
found is those efforts brought together Democrat and Republican, faith based and science based perspectives so that everyone could uh, help restore some of these foods back to our landscapes. And so in California, a dinner might have been focused on mission grapes and mission olives and the wonderful acorns and vegetables that you have. In the Midwest, it might be the heirloom turkeys and the cranberries and the many rare breeds of livestock that Midwestern farmers nearly lost that they're bringing back again. In the Deep South, the Cajun and Creole cooking that was imperiled by Hurricanes Rita and the oil spill. We worked to use these holidays to renew our covenant with those foods and the food producing landscapes that they come from. And hard ciders and local wines were part of those celebrations. And so I think we need to have something like a great American picnic in every community that reminds us what the unique beverages and food ingredients are of our own home place and make that part of our own cultural identity or multicultural identity. And that's an incredibly enjoyable effort that I think when we participate in that, it helps heal these political and ideological divides that we've had for so long. That sometimes farmers markets are the only places that Democrats and Republicans talk to one another anymore. And so I think we need to use food and beverage for their healing qualities that we all love to eat, we love to drink, we love to have the congenial conversations that come when we do that, and that allows us to put aside our differences and come together for common joys.
Yeah, I love that. And thank you so much for sharing your time and wisdom on this. I wonder if maybe as a send off for somebody who's just getting to know you, what would you recommend that they check out in terms of a book that you've written or anything as something especially relevant to today? That it would be also a great way to begin to know your work.
Well, thank you. There's three books that I'll mention real briefly. The Food from the Radical Center, that is case studies of how this reviving beverages and foods work has brought together people in communities from different backgrounds. My most recent book is called Jesus for Farmers and Fishers, Justice for All Who Have Been Marginalized by Our Current Food System. And even though that sounds like a uh, inherently Christian book. It's talking about the parables that help people in the Middle East from all backgrounds survive an existential food and farming crisis 2,000 years ago. So I think it's of interest to people more than just those who see Jesus as a prophet. And then finally, a book that I did with Slow Food USA and American livestock breeds and many beverage makers that's called Renewing America's Food Traditions. And that is a profile of the most distinctive and endangered beverages and foods region by region in North America.
Oh, that sounds great. Yeah. Yeah, you have been very active in the food justice as and farm worker justice. I mean, you've done a lot of work in those areas. I wish we could talk about that to some extent, but maybe I'll just ask you a hard question. um, I've talked about this with lots of people, and I wish that I had a way to do more, and I wonder if there's a perspective shift that I need, and I'm wondering if you have a sense, having worked in this space for so long, that you could talk about how I and others could combat perspectives inside ourselves.
Well, just keep in mind that the people who work in our fields that literally bring us our daily bread and wine are those most likely to have to go to a food bank to feed their own family. And to me, that's a national tragedy, and one that
Yeah,
we need to resolve by policy, first of all, to get farm workers and their advocates on every state agricultural commission, every farm board. The Farm Bureau has to quit being a white organization and open up its diversity in our state to the 22 uh, uh, sets of immigrants from various countries, the refugees that have swept into our country, welcome them and see them part of the solutions to our farm system. And so I think every time that we advocate for immigrant and indigenous farmers and orchard keepers and beverage makers, we're all enriched by that. We're impoverished when we remain in isolation from the people most in need in our food system. We are impoverished, not just them.
yeah. Well, that's a really good way to end, I think, and I really appreciate your time. It's really been a pleasure to talk with you. Thank you so much, Gary.
What wonderful questions, and thank you for your thoughtfulness, and blessings to all of your listeners who deeply care about these topics. I just think this kind of dialogue is what can help heal us all in this difficult time in our own country. So thank you.
Thank you.